your TV into an exciting game arcade. And there's more.
So 79 rolls around and we're getting to the point where home computers are getting pretty big, and you're starting to see them in more schools and even some homes.
This was the first time the personal computer really started to be affordable. By affordable, I mean like $4,000, $5,000, $6,000.
And naturally people are thinking, maybe I could try my hand at making a game.
You had major geeks buying these things. And there wasn't a lot to do.
This is where basic programming language comes in very handy.
What is it? Basic is a computer like language, right? It's a language.
I don't know, call Rue and ask him.
Developed back in the 60s when programming languages, that was a good time to start developing them, because hell, who wants to be programming in assembly all the time?
OMG.
Boom! We added something intelligent.
That's, I mean, if you don't learn basic, your option is to get harder. There's nothing simpler.
Moving the electrons with, magnetized pens into code however you want there. That's how they did it back in the Stone Age, I think.
Basic is called basic because it is easy. It's a high-level programming language, which means that you are further away from the nuts and bolts of what's going on in the computer.
And you started to see BASIC come out on various gaming platforms too.
Atari VCS, Bally Professional, Atari,
Odyssey, Television, Atari, they all had BASIC on it. It was almost like a craze.
I mean, granted, it was a giant pain in the ass to try to program in BASIC on the Atari VCS, but it could be done.
With the proliferation of BASIC as a computer language into the 70s, it gave way to actually more intricate PC gaming. And people could start creating their own games, and role-playing games actually started to become more popular.
It helped the first wave of our genius game creators to kind of get their feet wet.
One of the people most notably to get their start this year, supposedly, was Richard Garriott.
Lord British.
Mr. Ego.
Mr. Ego. Creates a top-down game that was clearly based off of Dungeons and Dragons.
Akalabeth, 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 Akalabeth. Also the game of the devil.
He was in high school. He was a high school kid.
He was in high school. He sold it.
Before the game was eventually distributed by California Pacific Computer Company, it was sold at a local computer store in Ziploc bags. Like most homegrown things. I mean, homebrewed. Winners don't use drugs.
No, it's interesting. With the with no internet, the video game, especially among computers, the creation, the scene was very much a local grassroots sort of thing. You didn't hear about a game unless it was good enough to be copied over and over and over and over again and actually make its way across the country.
The game's creator, Richard Garriott, says that it came out in 1979, but the labels on the first release clearly state 1980.
This was like the Wild West of computer game programming.
Richard Garriott, a controversy.
It was very simple at the time. Just an RPG, basically a dungeon crawler with a very rudimentary overworld map.
And this is what spawned, stuff that we'll see later on, like the Ultima series. I mean, this is big name stuff.
A company called Automated Simulations came out with another very early RPG called Temple of Apshai.
Where, you actually have graphical, this isn't even a text adventure, you have a representation of yourself on the screen, you move around and find treasure and fight monsters.
Not unsurprisingly, the company was founded by some guys who had a D&D game together. You can see the connection.
It was almost like a gaming revolution, literally from the ground up, in terms of kids and people just getting into a computer and just being fascinated by it. All of a sudden now they become the first run of a giant company that's going to be formed.
Automated Systems eventually became Epic's Games, and they released games, and they had some success through the 80s, and eventually they released California games on the NES. And then they went bankrupt.
I like when you were basic.
There you go.
Press start.
Galaxian warriors, today we're going up against the most feared commander, and everyone counts. Even you, Quid.
Man your ships, man your ships, man your ships.
Galaxian was Namco's answer to Space Invaders.
Taito comes out with Space Invaders. Big hit. huge hit.
We had this little luncheonette, and that luncheonette always had one pinball machine and one arcade machine. And I remember when they switched out the Space Invaders and they put Galaxian in there.
The plot was simple enough and it was summed up in 7 words on the title screen.
We are
the Galaxians.
Mission destroy aliens. Wait, are they robots? They are now.
The impact of a game like that at the time is amazing. I mean, you can't, it's kind of hard to imagine now. You look at it, you're like, it looks like kind of a weak Galaga, right? But if you played that game in 79 or 80, there was nothing else like it.
Space Invaders may have sort of created the genre, but Galaxian set the tone for how it was really going to play out for the rest of its lifespan.
Revolutionary for a time, like so many firsts in video games for that.
Seriously, like the graphics were crazy. Like it was the first game with RGB graphics, right?
You even know what RGB is?
That would be Red Game Boy.
I'm surprised you actually got that.
I'm not a complete moron.
It had sprites with multicolors, especially in the explosions when you destroyed them.
First game that had different colored fonts on the screen at the same time. First game to have a visual representation of how many players you had left and what stage you were on.
There were stars too.
There were stars!
Stars!
They moved!
It was beautiful.
This is not only in real color, but these guys are now coming after me. Like they're not just slowly marching down the screen. I gotta watch out where I'm going.
It was the first game that had enemies that acted differently and had different personalities.
But the enemies had like even their own attack patterns, including like kamikaze attacks, which was crazy.
Banzai!
The Galaxian enemies, as they come down, they will screw with you because depending on how many are left, they might, swoop down and then they'll just keep coming and they'll never reset to be easily shot again.
To have that all coming at you like that, where you had gotten so used to the slow march of Space Invaders before.
Like what? Even at best was like a shot a second.
Yep, and even like so, if you made a bad shot, it could be detrimental.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The game had its own theme song, one of the first games to get its very own recognizable theme song.
And a catchy one too.
It was a ditty. We're not talking orchestral quality, but again, they took the shot, Namco.
So Galaxian's like spanned like a life of its own after. You have Galaga, the sequel, and then the Gal bosses end up showing up and stuff, like even up to current gens.
That's right, Namco uses them great. Like there were power-ups in the Pac-Man Deluxe. You play Ridge Racer, there were like logos on the side of the car.
Galaxian deserves its props in the video game Hall of Fame that I'm building in my basement.
Galaxian set a sort of visual standard for how video games would look afterwards, especially in the arcade.
And it was just an amazing experience.
It felt like more just fun, not just cold and barren. Personality, cute and colorful, which would pave the way for another Namco game which would come a year later. That you can just wait and see what that one's going to be.
How's that for a cliffhanger? I don't know what we're talking about.
It's Halo.
High score.
And now Pat Contri presents The Forgotten Video Games of 1979.
Pat here to tell you about the forgotten video games of 1979. The Atari Cosmos. Atari developed a holographic LED tabletop game system. Unique, interesting, but it was never released. Sega produced Head-On, an arcade game featuring a race car traveling around a maze collecting dots. Yeah, we would never see that again in video games. And the TI-99. Long before they produced calculators that help you cheat on tests and play drug wars, Texas Instruments came out with this solid but underselling computer system. And those were the forgotten video games of 1979. Just because you didn't remember them doesn't mean they're not fun.
Coming up on part 3 of the video game years, 1979.
Who could forget the George Plimpton ads, right? Where he would stand there and show you, here's our baseball and here's the Atari baseball. And you were basically looking at stick figures versus really cool video games.
And it was really the year where you started getting away from those generic titles that you don't want to even remember, like Fun with Numbers.